Woodchip says the workshop is seeking to buy in of the beneficiary ECOWAS member states of steps to be taken to forestall further disruptions to supply.
There's activities and measures that we can take on our own, but we realize that we can't work in isolation. We have to work closely with the authorities of all the countries, of all the states, the White Peace states. So we're working with the navies to perform dedicated pipeline patrols. We're working with the governments, the harbor commissions that operate these electronic surveillance programs to monitor traffic, vessel traffic in and out of the harbors. We meet directly, one-on-one with the stakeholders who are here today.
Managing Director of WAPCO, Walter Perez, confirmed the gas pipeline was currently in very good condition to support the supply of gas.
The capacity was restored to original design, so the pipeline today is flowing, below the contracted volumes of 120 here in Ghana, but still substantially more than we were receiving about a month and a half or 2 months ago when the crisis emerged.
Defense Minister Makwayongo asked the 4 member states to protect the integrity of the pipeline just as they hold their maritime boundaries.
This calls for information sharing and effective collaboration among countries in the sub-region with a view to ensuring the security of the pipeline. It is also my hope that this forum will explore other cost-effective ways, such as the use of drones with shorter turnaround time to cover the pipeline protection zone rather than relying heavily on ships.
Chief Director of the Ministry of Energy and Petroleum, who represented the sector minister, talked about the effects the damage had on Ghana and called for coordinated approach to ensure the protection of the gas pipeline and other infrastructure.
We should forge together, particularly the 3 countries at the receiving end, should ensure that the maritime security becomes our primary goal of ensuring that the pipeline and other infrastructure are duly protected.
The workshop continues on Thursday, May 8. Officials will release a communiqué as to the best strategies adopted to safeguard the pipeline from future damage.
Ghana's energy challenges and the way forward, and that's the issue we're discussing today. And with me to discuss this is John Peter Amewu, who is Director, Policy and Research Analyst for Africa Center for Energy and Energy Policy. John, you're welcome.
Thank you, madam.
Very good, very good. Anytime we're talking energy, you come. I'm glad because I know we are going to be educated. But I want us to start from the West African pipeline. It's something which, as a layman, I find a bit confusing. Because for the whole purpose of it being built, and it has never done what it was built, and doesn't look like a cheap project. So, I mean, what is the aim? I mean, who owns it? And did Ghana pay any money towards it being built? And if the gas is not going to come through it, then what else can you use it for?
Well, thank you, Nana. Good evening to your listeners. Yes, you have genuine concerns to raise such very important question. This project, it's a project owned by 4 member states, Ghana, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and Benin. The rationale for the pipeline is to ship resources in terms of gas from resource-rich countries like Nigeria through Benin, Togo, and then Ghana. And so the ownership title of the pipeline lies solely on West Africa Gas Pipeline Company. It's a company with membership from all these 4 institutions. But the shipment procedure in terms of who shipped the gas is not necessarily the 4 countries. The gas is shipped from a gas resource country like Nigeria. And there is a company that is also responsible for shipping that gas. That company owns the gas in the pipeline. Okay. But the 4 member states which constitute the West African gas pipeline owns the infrastructure, which we call the West Africa gas pipeline. But the gas that passes through the pipeline is owned by the supplier.
So he pays some compensation or reduced cost to say, I'll use your pipes to supply you the gas? Or?
Yes, of course, the supplier also need an entry in terms of shipping the gas. So what the supplier would do is also to go to upstream for gas producers and sign what we call a gas purchase and supply agreement, based on which this gas will be supplied to, the 4 member countries. And so the supplier also have an agreement at the offshore companies which are producing the gas offshore or onshore, through which, these arrangements have been done contractually.
And the agreement was that you build this pipe and I'll give you 123 million cubic meters or cubic whatever it is of gas. And
not necessarily that. You see, in the gas market, you don't build infrastructure if you don't identify the source of demand. And so what would have been done under an ideal condition is to make sure that the demand is there. Then the infrastructure will be built. Because nobody builds infrastructure when the demand is not there. So, of course, these 4 member countries would have come out with what we call their minimum daily quantities. These minimum daily quantities works up to what we call the contract quantity per annum. And so it is based on that contract quantity that the supplier will ship the relevant supply of gas to these, companies that require. Most often in the gas and purchase agreement, there are provisions for what we call take or pay provisions, which presupposes that if I ship gas, above the minimum daily quantities, of course, you will have to pay. If you refuse to take that gas, you of course have to pay. That is a take or pay provision. Now, the otherwise, or in other scenarios, if you happen to ship gas less than what is required of the daily minimum quantity, you have to make what we call a makeup. Okay? So at another time, you have to add up the difference to make up for the shortfalls during periods which you were not able to make the minimum daily quantity shipment.
Now, this gas is coming from Nigeria, will go through, I think, Benin, Togo, before it gets to Ghana.
Yeah.
So have all these countries got like their little taps where they get
these countries are what we call off-takers. They are off-takers because the issue of off-taker reduce security issues. And so if you have a gas pipeline passing through your country, the rationale is that you also feed into that pipeline and also take responsibility of the pipeline at that stretch within your territorial zone. And so the gas pipeline itself has a different fiscal regime in the sense that one country doesn't impose its fiscal regime on the pipeline because the pipeline passes through Togo at this length. This particular length has to rely within the regime of Togo. It doesn't work that way. These 4 companies come together with a common fiscal regime in terms of regulatory framework that apply throughout the total length of the pipeline.
Now, are all these other countries complaining about how much gas they're getting, or is it only Ghana that's struggling with their their gas supply?
Of course, if we are not receiving our minimum daily quantities,
means they also,
of course, may not be receiving exactly what is required of their consumption level. Yeah.
Now, the truth of the matter from later research is that we are never going to get that gas. I mean, it's going to get worse. It's not going to get any better because Nigeria now needs the gas.
Well, that is a good question. But you see, the availability of gas in Nigeria is quite huge. Currently, Nigeria is among one of the first 5 to be described as a polluter of gas, firing in terms of venting. So that means there's excess gas in Nigeria that can be supplied to feed, most of the West African countries. What is needed is the framework. Okay, why are we not getting the gas? There are various reasons why we're not getting the gas supply. And I don't think this is the time to go into some of those details.
Okay, just briefly, because I hear Nigeria wants to move to, I think, 15,000 kilowatts of electricity.
Yeah.
And therefore they need...
Megawatts.
And they need, I think, like 1 trillion cubic feet of this gas.
Metric standard cubic feet of gas.
So they don't have enough system to pump that into their system and then pump some to other people.
No, even with Nigeria's aggressive strategy of generation increment, there could still be sufficient gas
to go around.
Okay. You know, the whole of this. So the gas availability is there.
It's just a framework.
It's just a framework. The framework, number one, in terms of constant payment of the gas delivery. I know a lot of school of thought will say Ghana government is making the payment as in due. But I can tell you the last shortages that we witnessed from reliable sources was as a result of some lacks in payment, procedures, and that caused us to have that delay. You know, what happens in the gas industry, for instance, is that if you have a long-term purchase agreement with me for which I need to deliver a minimum daily quantity of gas, and I have to make up, the make-up is such that if there's a shortfall, I must live up to that expectation. But if I cannot live up to that expectation, then I must live to specific performance in terms of damages. So probably I have to pay you the cost of damages. Now, if for some reasons there have been lapses in terms of you paying me, okay, I can cleverly ship that gas to another mature province that is prepared to pay a higher price. And because the price you are paying me is less than what I have achieved from there, I'll prepare to make the makeup in terms of specific performance by adhering to the damage clause.
As
okay?
to make it some margin.
Yes, so just to give you some money and then ship the gas probably at a more expensive cost, price, and get my return on investment. Every businessman wants some level of return on its investment. So they are looking for opportunities in the market where this gas should be shipped. And so if we are not living up to our expectation in terms of agreement, other markets will be ready to receive those gas provisions.
Even if they give us the contractual 123 million, it's still not enough.
Yeah, that is the minimum contract quantity. It
That's
means
the minimum,
yes,
so we could still go
up. Go above.
But
even with that, it will still not be enough. According to Energy Commission, our gas requirement up to a period of 2015-2014 is quite high, which is almost about 400 million cubic standard feet of gas per day. And so even if you take this 120, assuming they are supplying the minimum fully, 120, and then you add what we're going to get from Jubilee, 120 people say, I disagree with that, maximum 1,800, that gives us to about 220. Even if Sankofa come on board by 2015, 2016, 17, most probably, okay, which will bring another 20, we'll be getting about 300. Okay, at that point, our demand is about 400, so there's going to be a shortfall of about 100. So we have a problem going forward in terms of our gas requirement.
At that time, won't the nation's demand have gotten up so that we need about 600-700 then?
That is a brilliant question because our growth in terms of energy demand is about 12-10%. And so definitely that will grow up. But that availability could, of course, feed some of the generation plans that we have. Okay? For instance, Asogli with a maximum of about 40-60 will be able to fire the 300 megawatts that we have, 280. And so that can be able to push some of the generation plants, which will put us in a very competitive platform to be able to deliver power. Of course, even not at peak period, at period that will enable you and I to have our lights on.
So then one would then ask that it's like, our generation would not live to see a day where light off or something where we read in history books.
You see, the transition process in which we are passing through is a common process in every electricity regime. California have witnessed the same system. America, as we talk today, have passed through such process. So it is not new. I mean, nobody should mistake that what we are experiencing in Ghana is new. But of course, there should have been some policy decision would have placed us in a better position for us to minimize the kind of difficulties that we are encountering. It is not new at all. Because you see, the energy system works differently. Number one, electricity cannot be stored. I hope you are aware.
Yes, produce and use.
Gas can be stored. Electricity produced is consumed instantaneously. The demand for electricity is not used because of that electricity. It's a derived demand. You get the electricity and you use it for something else. So some appliances would have to use it. And so the circumstances in the industry are very different, such that if you want to produce and consume, then your consumption level must equal to your production level. So there are two specific policy decisions every emerging country would have to decide. Number one, do we as a country should have sufficient electricity to meet our demand at any particular point in time? Or we should have excess supply to meet demand as we grow. Don't forget, if you go for the second option, having excess supply to meet demand, the question you ask yourself, are you prepared to pay for redundant capacity? Because to have an excess demand simple means, excess supply, simple means that you need to generate some plants that will be idle. If it is idle, you will still have to pay for it. For instance, let me give you an example. In France, one of their nuclear plants for the past 25 years has worked only for 3 hours. 25 years, it works for only 3 hours at peak period. Okay? But socialization in terms of redundancy for that particular plant would have to be paid for because they make provisions for reliability of supply. And so these are the two scenarios. But what is difficult for us is that because of the tariff regime in which we find ourselves, civil society groups, politicians, every time playing into the game, capturing regulatory performances, it becomes very difficult for us to have excess supply to meet demand at any particular point in time. This is where our problems comes from. And this is the beginning of our difficulty.
The excess demand, I was listening to Fletcher this morning and he says, look, you need about 20%, there, so that in case one machine goes down, you have, 20% idle, probably energy somewhere or plant somewhere that can, if you're servicing this one comes in to feed the nation and stuff like that. But where we are now, we are playing catch up as to current, so that as soon as one machine goes down, that's it. There's no extra anywhere, to sort it out. And like you say, I would go for the second option, that as a developing nation, and since we are even talking about industrialization, then definitely you need to look at excess. But we're going to go on a break, and then when I come back, I'll get John to answer that. Ghana's energy challenges and the way forward. And just before we went on a break, I was just trying to find out that if we need to keep a 20% reserve just in case. And at the moment we are growing, I think 10-12%, which means every year you need to be, moving ahead of time. But John, what then happens is that anytime VRA says, look, you shut down because you're going to go on servicing, you turn it up and then we have lights.
Yeah, that is right. You see, again, the rationale for the excess reserve is just to make up for the shortfalls in terms of any time that there is a need for, like what we are witnessing, a systematic maintenance of plants. Then you come out with a new plant, that will pick up that shortfalls in the supply. But the system of having an idle plant for reserve capacity, it's again not a very good policy in what we are witnessing now. What can be done in an ideal world is to have what we call a spinning reserve, where your reserve capacity is spread over a number of plants.
Okay.
By doing so, you have diversified your risk portfolio. The danger of having one plant as an excess reserve capacity is that in terms of excess capacity to take off for peak period, you might go to spark that plant or to turn that plant on, and the plant will fail you. And so in a modern world, having a number of plants sitting down doesn't really work.
So you'd rather maybe Asogile, instead of 300, instead of firing 200,
good.
Instead of T3 doing 180, just do 150.
Good. So you spread the capacity among a number of plants, so that those plants are not allowed to operate at their maximum optimum level. So if there is a need for increase in terms of peak, they only take up. And again, the advantage for that approach is that the period for take-up is very sweet. You don't have to wait for a number of minutes or seconds before you achieve the peak, because the spinning reserve allows that system to work automatically, which is number one. And number two, another advantage is that the risk profile are spread all over. So that is a policy initiative that we should be looking at, rather than building several plants sitting down waiting for excess capacity to generate power.
John, another school of thought is privatization. You know, but as soon as you say privatization, you know, we panic because we like, you know, cheap bills, you know, and if it's going to be privatized, then everybody knows, oh, that means the bills are going to be too high. Should we privatize, or should government go ahead and, you know, build more dams and get more plants?
You see, over a long period, the energy sector has been considered as a strategic asset. And so at that point, for the purpose of security of supply, there was a high level of monopoly. And that monopoly was a state monopoly, because states want to make sure that they have control over the supply scenarios of electricity. Now, in the 80s, it became clear that the responsibility of making power available to citizens cannot be a state responsibility alone. So that tendency of politicalization of energy policy therefore moved towards depoliticalization. And by the depoliticalization, some of the state's agencies are being sold to private entities just for the purpose of privatization. Privatization simply means selling a state property to an individual. But you see, there is no competitive research that establishes why a state institution cannot compete with a private institution. The rationale basically is that they think the private will be able to do it better. But that is not at all. The state institution can also perform very well. Now, the issue of privatization in the sector, it's so complex. Do you have to look at a top-bottom approach or a bottom-up approach? Because you see, the electricity sector is the same as the gas sector. The downstream gas sector operates just the same as the electricity sector. We have the generation, the transmission, distribution, supply, and metering. It is the same. The only difference between the gas and the electricity is that you can store gas and you cannot store electricity. So the system of operation is the same. Now, if you are privatizing, that will not necessarily take you to competition. Privatization does not lead to competition. Privatization is just taking the state's hands out, taking that monopoly position out.
That's going to be dangerous for the bills.
Yes, but it is the liberalization of the system that will take you to competition, which is expected to reduce the price. But even with the liberalization, the question we need to ask is, where do we start from? Do we start from generation, transmission, distribution, supply, and metering, or you start from metering through supply to generation? Ghana now, we are mixing the whole scenarios. You see private independent power producers doing generation, and even some of these generations are not done within the framework of competitive environment, because the licenses are just being issued to them. So there's no competition even at generation point. Because if there's a competition at generation point, we must expect prices to reduce right down from the generation point. That we are not witnessing. Now, if you come to supply, some of the meters are being supplied by these Chinese companies. Fine. There is nothing wrong at all for an independent, suppliers to be responsible for metering, while probably the ECG is responsible for supply. There's nothing wrong at all. But you see, when you are not in a very competitive environment and you allow such a sensitive item such as metering to be taken by the private sector, then the cost build-up might not lead to a reduction at the benefit price for the consumer. And so that is one thing we are witnessing in the country. That segment is currently being taken by the Chinese company. They are supplying the meters. But there's no competition at that level. So how do you achieve a reduction in the price? The question I will ask the policymakers is, in terms of the competitive framework of this generation down to supply, where are we starting from? Because we seem to be mixing the two. We can still have a number of companies to be responsible for the transmission, okay? Because our transmissions lines vary. Some can go directly to the north, some to the southern zone. So those that go to the southern zone can be given to companies to handle. Those to the northern zone can also be given to another company to handle. In terms of supply, just as ECG, different companies can do supply based on geographical basis. If you go to Europe today, you have different companies supplying electricity. You can decide today you don't need Scottish gas, and you call another company to come and supply you power. That is the level in which we need to move as a country. But then we must have a clear framework as how we go. As I speak now, there is no framework as to how these independent power producers would even operate within the market. Okay? Everybody comes in and negotiates for power purchase agreements based on its strength, and prices in terms of rates are given differently. The frameworks are not quite clear. For an independent power producer to enter a system to generate power, one of the most important requirements is to pre-estimate the distribution losses. Our distribution losses are still not clear. And so if I'm an independent power producer, I want to generate power, and I don't have a clear framework as how much the losses are, what indication is it there for me to come in and operate? So privatization is good, but how do we translate that privatization to a competitive environment? That can only be achieved through liberalization. And if it's going to be achieved through liberalization, what system or at what point are we starting the competition from? Is it going to be from metering down to generation, or from generation down to metering? These are issues that we need to ask as a country.
Well, the other thing as well is, you see, at the moment, even if you're private, you need to generate and then sell it to state, and then state sells it to us. Because private won't sell it directly to you. Now, at what unit are they selling it to state? And at what unit are we buying from state?
You see, that is a very good question. One of the difficulties for the PPA arrangement is also the question that the independent power generators think that the state generators have achieved a long-term return on their investment. And so, of course, their cost of supply should reduce. I mean, they are making a very sensitive point. Because, for instance, if you take VRA, some of these VRA plants have lived for ages. Now, what that means is that the capital cost over the period, of course, they would have recouped that capital cost. What it's needed now is the operational cost. Now, if I come into the system to generate a power at a point in time where VRA has almost spent about 15, 20 years, I don't expect my price to trade at the same rate as VRA's price. Why? Because I would have to recoup my capex and therefore go on to, recapture my operational expenditure, which is the OPEX. So, of course, I might expect a higher return than what the VRA would expect. But the point of argument and the confusion is that the state agencies will say, no, of course, why are the independent power producers being paid higher than we are being paid? But this is the difficulty, and this is the point in which they must look at it. If we agree that, of course, the operational expenditure and the capex are very necessary for new entrants into the system, and therefore, in arriving at their PPA in terms of the tariff for them, it should be slightly higher than the state agencies. The system can, work in that direction.
John, at the moment, gas, I can say we don't have enough gas, and thermal is way too expensive. So how do we move forward to have enough energy where, we can industrialize? And when we can industrialize, and I got it from you that you don't talk about 5,000 megawatts and talk about industrialization. Forget about that. So at what point do we get enough energy, and from where?
I think the problem of Ghana must be tackled from multi-angles, both government, individuals, and people like you sitting here. Sincerely, I think that the era where we always run to supply to live up to demand expectation is gone. We're not ever going to witness that, because oil prices keep going up. Mm-hmm. Those days, America can just take a telephone and call Saudi Arabia, we need you to pump, 4 million barrels of oil into the market. Those areas are gone. Those era, it's gone. What we need to do now is, how does supply on its own live up to its expectation? Mm-hmm. How do we do that? So we need to do a bit of supply side management also. Conservation of power. If, as I speak now, our energy intensity in terms of how much units of energy is used in producing 1 unit change in GDP, it's not comparable to international standard. We are using too much energy to produce a unit change in GDP. The reason is why. It all runs down to inefficient management of our system. So going forward, I think the citizens on their own will have to do an internal assessment of how they consume power. How do you do that? Right down from decision-making stage, when you want to go and buy appliances. What kind of appliances do you want to buy? Mm-hmm. You see, the difficulty is that the power sector is that if you go to procure an appliance, okay, you are going to use the power accordingly. Mm-hmm. you can't change the use again. So appliance decision making becomes very critical in your power consumption, analysis. Right down at that point, we need to make creditable decisions as to the type of appliances that we use. What point do we do more ironing, for instance, in our homes? You see, the power industry, for instance, if 10 of us consume, say, 1 megawatt of power at the same time, we will end up consuming how much? 100 megawatts. If 10 of us consume 10 megawatts at a time, we'll end up consuming 100 megawatts at a time. But if we consume 10 megawatts, one after the other, sequential, we'll end up consuming what? 10 megawatts at a particular point in time. So we are putting less pressure on the facilities if you arrange our consumption pattern. And so we need to arrange our consumption pattern. That is the demand side management. The other way is to begin to look at other alternatives ways of generating power.
It might be funny, but should we say then, those who live in Matayeko iron between 7 and 8, and then from then Kaneshi should do 9 to 10, and then East Legon should do, 5 to 6?
It is an alternative. It is because, you see, if you put in the power into the system, if it is not used, it still remains in the system. And you see, we need a system also to be stabilized to give a very reliable form of delivery in terms of how the power system works. And so, if we can plan our system such that at a certain particular point in time, there's sufficient energy for everybody to consume, everybody will come to the peak and consume. But if we all cannot go to the peak at the same time, then at off-peak period, some people must be there to consume. If you go to your house today and want to iron, okay, we are now getting close to peak, and the demand might not be, available. But in the morning, when people are off their homes, you have that availability period to consume. So we should learn to consume our power, in a sequential form rather than a simultaneous consumption pattern as a country. That is one way of doing it. Another way is to look at probably the cost pattern in terms of the fuel mix. Ghana largely will rely on light crude oil to fire most of the plants. We could make research to find out why it will not be possible to use a blend of light crude and then a heavy crude. That will reduce the cost that you put in, because the feed is also very expensive. So if you are able to reduce the operational cost, the cost at the burner tip can also equally be reduced. We have to also look at our distribution losses, which I keep on saying every time. It's quite still high. I
want to take a break, and then we come back to distribution costs. And also, Engineer Wood was on the show, and he was saying, listen, if you do biofuels and adjust these machines a little bit, they will fire up. They've tried and tested before. Why shouldn't you do that? And then also we'll look at Woodchip gas. We'll find out about that too. Stay tuned. Well, just before the break, we were looking at old lines and, the amount of transmission losses in there. You don't have governors lines, and a bed goes in there and that's it, it's gone. And the amount of energy you lose through it. I want us to also look at Woodchip gas, how it will work. And so, I'll let you talk about that. These old lines, how much money does the state need to reduce the transmission loss? Because it's close about 30%.
Yeah, 26, 23. It keeps on, yeah. If you add the transmission and distribution all together, then you might be getting close to 30.
And then if you add our behavior to it, then we are 40 then, isn't it?
Probably, yeah.
So if we go to these lines, how much would it cost the state to go the lines which reduce transmission losses?
You see, there are various reasons why we have some of these losses, the distribution losses. Some of them are technicals. You have to encounter those differences. Others are through theft. Okay, the rest are through the existence of old infrastructure which needs to be upgraded, and that is where our trouble is. But you agree with me that I think government is trying to put in more of some of those transmission lines now, but that is not enough. A lot needs to be done at the distribution side, because if you generate 100 megawatts of power and you can only supply, say, 80% of that, what does the rest 20% goes in for? That is a cost to somebody, and who pays that cost? Invariably, they'll tell you that nobody is paying for it, but indirectly, the consumer is paying for that, because that will enable the producer to be at a very competitive platform to be able to deliver. So though you'll be told that you are not paying for it, we pay for some of these losses. Of course, it's going to cost for it. It's going to, its price build up. We'll have to include the 100, taking care of some of the institutional or statutory losses that might not be included in what you pay. But you definitely have to pay for some of these losses. So I think it's important for government to begin to do more investment. What we are seeing now is not enough. We need to see more investment into that area, and also the management of the system as a whole. I stated earlier on that we need to put in some level of competition, for the distribution angle of the supply side, to make sure that other people also come in and compete with the existing distribution company, which is the ECG.
Let me add this before you go. I mean, couldn't there be a system where, says, look, for every house you build, 10 or 15% of your energy should be renewable, within the household. So somebody comes and assesses how many air conditioners you have or how many bulbs you have. Say, look, you need to use, X amount of electricity. So this should come from either wind power or
that's a very brilliant point. And as a country, we have that. The renewable law is there, and in the renewable law, the agenda was to achieve, I think, 20% by 2020, which is, of course, is over ambitious. It is not achievable at all. But that was the targets in that renewable law, which was passed in Parliament. But as a country, we are good at passing good laws, and the implementation of the laws becomes a problem. What the law states, is that there is a provision for what we call renewable obligation certificate. And so that renewable obligation certificate would have to go in for the conventional generators, such that every unit of generation that they have, they would have to add that percentage of the renewable. So for instance, if Asogli is generating 300 megawatts of power, the law will say that the renewable obligation certificate will force Asogli to buy, 20% of renewable from somebody who is producing a renewable. So if you are generating a renewable, because of this law, you don't necessarily have to sell that renewable to an existing customer. You can sell the renewable to an existing generator, because the law is forcing those generators to have a part of their power mix, certain proportions of renewable. But these things are there on paper, and we are not implementing it. I mean, we can only do this when we as a country come together and realize the difficulties in which you are. You made a very brilliant point about putting panels on, top of buildings in, houses instead of extending transmission lines, which is good, which you call embedded generation. That is also an option of introducing some level of renewable technology into the sector. But do we have that as a policy, as conscious efforts by government? All these high-rise buildings that we have in the city of Accra, what policy are we putting in place to make sure that some level of renewable is generated and used by those customers who live within those premises? We need to, force some of these laws to work. That is the only way we can get a proper usage of our power supply.
The next one is a Woodchip Gas Generator.
Yeah.
And apparently it's been used from First World War through Second World War. It's been tried and tested. It's nothing new. We have the land to plant the wood. We have the technology to get these generators, So, I mean, can we start using them for maybe smaller communities or schools? Maybe, get schools off the grid and they use it.
Well, these are all innovations, and there are new technologies that can be used in terms of the renewable. They also form part of the renewable, because the trees that are planted, as you take them out, you can come back and plant new ones. So they can be used. But again, the difficulty with that approach is the cost. In everything we do in the energy sector, what is critical is the cost. I have not been able to come up with any cost analysis on how much that is going to cost us, and considering also some level of pollution that may be generated. I know the system is such that they'll be able to capture some of those gases that may come out. But we need to do a lot more cost-bill analysis to see how relevant that system will be to the country.
I think, if I remember quite well, the average to produce 1 megawatt is like $1 million.
$1 million to produce 1 megawatt.
1 megawatt,
well,
yeah, averagely.
Yeah, that is good, but that is again expensive, because you need about $760,000 probably to produce a megawatt of, say, a combined cycle gas turbine. So you see, that is cheaper.
No, I was talking about hydro. It will cost you about $1 million.
No, hydro will cost you about $980 to $1 million. Yes, you are right. Yeah. Yes.
And so this one, the wood chip was working out much cheaper.
Okay, it works cheaper than hydro.
Yeah, it works out cheaper than, it was working out cheaper than hydro. Okay. And, you know, I think because it's an old technology, it's not, you know, there are enough generators around which...
and of course, that system also provides a lot of employment opportunities. Some people providing the feed in terms of the wood. You know, there's also a lot of employment activity there to the people that will be generating there. Yes, it is possible, but I think as a country we need to do a bit more studies.
Are we too conventional? Do we? I think we are too conventional.
I agree with you, because the conventional system seems to be cheaper, and everyone wants to go into the conventional way. As we speak now, still the modern concept is going to coal. To use coal to produce, power, because that is cheaper. The conventional system is the way for emerging countries like Ghana. America is still using coal. China is firing coal all over the world. So nothing stops us from using coal. We must also pollute part of the environment, as the developed countries have done. So I don't see anything wrong going through the conventional system, because as a country, it is cheaper for us. You see, the renewable, as I keep on saying, is very cost unfriendly. It's unfriendly in terms of the cost. Don't forget, number one, in the sense that even the conventional fuel system has been subsidized. And so the renewable, therefore, finds itself in a very uncompetitive environment, because government is already subsidizing the conventional system. And so renewable will definitely be more expensive in such a system. What government needs to do is to say, well, I want the renewable. And if government says he wants renewable, he must do something to reduce the cost of renewable. So we think that subsidy must be moved from the conventional fuel system to the renewable system. Number one, that also reduces the element of pollution. And so that can bring our power demands into a level that will make it more sustainable for a country.
John Peter Amewu, thank you very much. Director and Research Analyst for Africa Center for Energy and Policy. Folks, as I always say, thanks for watching. But on Thursday, 2:05 p.m. on Joy FM or My Joy Online, those of you who follow That's My Opinion, we have a beautiful piece coming, and it's about the 200 girls or over 200 girls who are missing in Nigeria. It's a wonderful piece. It would shed light and realize how selfish we have become as a people. Don't miss that show. You have to tune in. But once again, thanks for watching, and tomorrow we'll be back to do it all over again.